Okay, my name is Lawrence McGlynn, and you are listening to the award-winning Philadelphia Hall Monitor here on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHMWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll discuss the U.S. government's illegal actions in Venezuela. We'll preview the 2026 election calendar and government calendar. And Lance Haber will walk us through the various minimum wage increases across the country. Denise, Happy New Year. How are you tonight?
I'm good. Happy New Year to you too.
Good. It's been an eventful couple of weeks since we've been on the air. And Denise, you're not going to believe this. The president of Venezuela was kidnapped. And you're going to be shocked when you find out where he ended up. So to tell us about that, we're going to bring on Vanessa Maria Graber. Vanessa, how are you tonight?
Hello and Happy New Year. Welcome back, everyone.
So one of the most surprising things I've ever seen, and I don't even know how to couch that anymore. Is it really surprising? I don't know. Happened just last week. The United States sent in troops to subdue the president of another of another nation. That's where I'm just going to leave it, and you can take it from there.
That is correct. Early in the morning on Saturday, over the weekend, U.S. Delta Force troops, along with the FBI, went to the capital of Venezuela in Caracas, to the presidential palace of Miraflores, and they essentially kidnapped President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and took them to the United States. They have both been extradited and charged with a number of charges around drug trafficking and weapons possession. And they are both being held right now in New York City in very secure facilities, same prison where Luigi Mangione was, and Diddy, and many other high-profile people who have been charged with crimes. Right now in Venezuela, the vice president has been sworn in, Dulce Rodriguez, and she is serving as interim vice president for the next 90 days. And according to news reports, that I read yesterday, allegedly Venezuela has committed to giving the United States anywhere from 30 to 50 million barrels of oil in the next year. And so President Trump has been giving a number of statements justifying his actions. Initially, before this all happened, the U.S. had been bombing boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific that were allegedly used for drug trafficking, although the government has never showed any evidence of that, never shown any photos or video or literally anything to show that these boats were carrying drugs, and what are essentially extrajudicial killings, killed more than 100 people on those boats in an effort to fight the war on drugs. President Trump has falsely claimed that Venezuela is responsible for a lot of the drugs coming into the United States. Of course, many experts on drug trafficking have debunked that and shown where drugs are actually coming from, countries like Ecuador and Colombia and China and Mexico. And hold on 1 second.
Oscar doesn't like this either.
Yes, Oscar always has something to say when I'm on the Hall Monitor. This is, live radio and television. But essentially, the premise for this, building up to the event that happened over the weekend, was this was about drug trafficking and stopping the flow of drugs into the United States. And what Donald Trump wound up revealing after this all transpired is that they wanted the oil in Venezuela. They felt as though this oil was owed to them. It belonged to the United States. And he said repeatedly, we're taking the oil. And so one of the things that was interesting is that Congress did not get a heads up about this mission, but President Trump admitted that he had given oil company executives a heads up before this happened and a briefing afterwards. So these oil executives had more information than members of our Senate and our House of Representatives. And again, this just shows that a lot of the arguments and justification for this being about drug trafficking begin to really crumble when you hear about all of the plans for oil in the United States. And so I just want to say I am not an expert on Venezuela. I have taken graduate courses on Venezuelan history. I had studied former President Hugo Chavez's investment in community and independent media in the early 2000s and the Bolivarian Revolution. However, a lot has changed since then, since President Maduro took power, and the US has increased crippling sanctions that have strangled the economy. What I do know is that at this time, there is a lot of disinformation being circulated. And so we really do have to verify sources and look out for AI-generated images and videos and check the sources of things being circulated, especially on messaging apps and on social media. Many people were circulating images of President Maduro being captured, and almost all of those images were AI generated. And sorry to say, even if it comes from Donald Trump or the White House, we still have to verify it because they have previously shared AI-generated videos and images in the past. So just because it is from a government source does not mean that it is verified. Now, this also relates to videos that we've seen about Venezuelans celebrating in the streets. A lot of these videos are also AI-generated, or they're clipped and out of context. And so one thing that I can tell you in order to help people understand is that the political situation in Venezuela is extremely complex. And it's very similar to the United States and many other countries around the world where there are a lot of political divisions. So in Venezuela, of course, there are people that support Chavismo or the Bolivarian Revolution. This is the socialism that was started by Hugo Chavez and continued by the Maduro government. And those are the people that are largely in the streets demanding his return. There's also a right-wing opposition. This historically has been led by an upper class, white-led group of aristocrats who have a lineage in, owning a lot of plantations and aristocracy, and this was the very entity that was dismantled by the Bolivarian Revolution. However, there is also a large group of people that neither supports Maduro nor do they support the opposition. I think many people can relate to that in the United States. And of course, there are people that are politically disengaged. They're not political at all. They don't trust anybody. And there are people that support, very small niche third parties. So it is intellectually dishonest to say that everyone is supporting Maduro or everyone is supporting the opposition. There are a lot of political divisions, and if you talk to 10 Venezuelans, you will probably get 10 different perspectives. And so that is really important to note. However, a lot of people, regardless of their political affiliation, are very scared, are very concerned about the future of Venezuela when a sovereign leader has been removed by force. And then in exchange, their natural resources have to be handed over to the United States. And so many Venezuelans that I talk to are very concerned about that. They're very concerned about the future. They believe that this is a violation of international law. Many scholars and legal experts are saying that this violates the UN Charter and that there is no legal basis for the US to intervene into the affairs of another country. And so what the international community will do next remains to be seen. I think because of all the tariffs and financial sanctions that Trump has put on even its allies, on his allies, has meant that people have a little bit more trepidation before publicly calling out the United States and calling for some type of investigation or intervention to take place. Now, China and Russia have called for a UN Security Council meeting. So again, we'll see what happens with that. And of course, there have been more threats to other Latin American countries like Cuba, Colombia, and Mexico. And their corresponding presidents have all spoken out against that and reasserted their sovereignty. And so I think a lot of Americans wondering what is the legal justification for this, and are also concerned about the amount of tax money that was spent on this. More than 80 people were killed in this mission. And I guess, we're all still trying to figure out what the facts are of the situation and figure out what the future relationship with Venezuela is going to be, both, with the remaining Maduro administration and the interim president, Dulce Rodriguez, but also if there will be troops on the ground doing some other type of intervention like we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan.
To me, this is a continuation of horrible American policy in Latin America and South America. You can go back to the 50s with the United Fruit Company, where the CIA worked with a literal fruit company to, basically take over farms in Guatemala and take over the government so that a banana company could have better, could pay the workers less. We could talk about the School of the Americas. We could talk about all sorts of different things here. This is just a continuation of what this country has done to our neighbors.
Yeah, and as a Puerto Rican woman, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the colonization of Puerto Rico and the reoccupation of Puerto Rico as a military outpost for the United States. Maduro's first stop on the way to New York was in Puerto Rico at the Ramey Air Force Base in Aguadilla. And for the last couple of months there, troops have been arriving on the ground. There have been drones launching from Puerto Rico. They're the ones carrying out the bombing of those boats. And so, we have a U.S. colony already where people are treated as second-class citizens and denied rights. And there's been very harmful health impacts from the testing of munitions, in Puerto Rico. So I think, when it comes to the future of Venezuela, I think a lot of Puerto Ricans will say, well, you don't want to wind up like us and be colonized as well. Puerto Rico has been colonized for 128 years. So, it's the longest colony. And I think that is why there's been a lot of Latin American solidarity in these last coming weeks, right? Because the entire region is affected. And it really begs the question of what does it mean to be a sovereign nation? And what does it mean to have international rule of law? If there is no accountability and nations are not sovereign, then what does that mean? And I think we're all waiting to see how other countries are going to react and if there is any type of accountability process imposed on the United States. I mean, can you imagine if a foreign entity came here and kidnapped Donald Trump and took him away?
Your mouth to God's ears.
Well, for one thing, they'd give him back.
Yeah.
but for another thing, and I can't help but see the irony of a nation whose foreign policy is basically, if you're brown and speak Spanish, we want you out of here, now creating another set of, for want of a better way to put it, refugees by going into their country, threatening their leadership, and causing dissension. Because if you don't think this is going to lead to another group of Venezuelan expatriates showing up on our shores, you have not been paying attention to American foreign policy over like the last 100 or so years. Because, you know, if you notice all of the countries where people are coming here from these other countries, there is some form of American shenanigans that took place in advance. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the next, you know, hostile government takeover you heard about was in Nigeria. And it's for the same reason that you might have gotten the takeover in Venezuela, because the only groups of people that have as much oil as the Middle East are Venezuela and Nigeria. And it's no accident that all of a sudden the United States has the compulsion to liberate people in those two places, especially since they have basically declared that this is their hemisphere, and they're still talking about annexing Greenland, which the folks in the Netherlands are you do it and we're gonna sick NATO on you. And since NATO has kind of had it with the United States in the first place, I think they'll take that fight on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to be clear, when you say shenanigans, we're really talking about destabilization of these countries' infrastructure and resource extraction. You know, we don't go into places and destabilize unless there's resources to extract. This is the playbook of imperialism and colonialism. And so for people that think that those terms are antiquated, I would challenge you to look historically of how colonialism was used in continents like Africa to destabilize and to extract. And all over Latin America, as Larry mentioned, in the last 150 years, there's been more than 24 interventions across Latin America anytime a country has asserted any type of economic independence. And so that's why we're paying close attention to places where there is some type of economic sovereignty plus resources for them to take. The U.S. has bombed 8 nations in the last year. That's more than any other sitting president. So in addition to bombing Nigeria and Venezuela, the U.S. has bombed Yemen. There was airstrikes in Iran as well, and more, right? And so, you know, how does that relate to us, the U.S. taxpayer? Well, many of the reasons why we don't have things like healthcare and investments in infrastructure and education is because all of these military interventions cost billions and billions of dollars. And I think the simplest way to understand Venezuela, along with all of these other interventions, is to simply follow the money and see who is profiting on Wall Street this week as a result of these actions.
And
or even just to look at who's profiting in terms of the oil companies, because the oil companies all sat down with the president and said, we want Citgo, which is Venezuela's old oil company. We want this. They don't want to sell it to us. And basically Trump said, I'll go get it for you. And that is roughly, 75 to 85% of what this is all about. And there's another irony that, few of us are talking about, is the fact that if you're going to say that Maduro is a drug lord, then why did you pardon the former president of Honduras, who not only was convicted in an American court, but he was convicted in an American court for being an actual drug lord?
right.
So, because that was the first thing that came to mind when I woke up at 7:30 on Saturday morning and saw this in my Associated Press updates. Okay, you just pardoned an international drug lord. So you're going into this other country to take out a guy that you say is an international drug lord? Make it make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're referring to former President Juan Orlando, former president of Honduras, who allegedly, moved more than 400 tons of cocaine. And I just want to note that, He was arrested. He was, put in front of a judge. He was tried. Evidence was presented, and he was sentenced. So there was a whole process around that. Yet the more than 100 people who were in those boats allegedly drug trafficking were not afforded any type of due process under the law. They were not brought in and put in front of a judge. Evidence was not presented. And it just goes to show that even if you are responsible for drug trafficking, the sentence for that is not death. And so the fact that more than 100 people were sentenced to death by Trump and his administration, again, violates international law. And Denise made an important point about Citgo. Well, who just bought Citgo? Paul Singer, the founder of Elliott Management. Who is Paul Singer? He's one of President Trump's top donors. And so again, when you follow the money and see who's profiting off of this, they are people in Trump's inner circle. They are his top donors who are invested in these fossil fuel companies.
Yeah. And, the thing that keeps sort of replaying over in my mind, at least the last few days over the weekend, is, to me, this is very similar to the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. A lot of questions as to why we're even going to do this, right? The common denominator is oil, and all the companies that were friends of the president and vice president specifically, who got no bid contracts to go in there and make a lot of money when we overthrew yet another sovereign nation, and which ended horribly and is still a total disaster all these years later. I am very, very concerned at this point. They're already talking about Cuba. We keep hearing, well, they're in trouble too. We got to look at Cuba. And the Greenland thing, that keeps coming up. Greenland, it's a Danish possession. It's covered by NATO. I don't know what these guys are thinking. They're insane. This is all insane.
It's interesting because Greenlanders, like Puerto Ricans, say we don't want to be colonized by the Danish, but we also don't want to be colonized by the United States. Can we just get our independence already? So I think we have to, change the narrative a little bit, because, the Danish colonization of Greenland has also been problematic. But this is colonialism, right? Like, we have two Western powers fighting over a strategic possession, right? And for people that don't know, the U.S. already has a military base in Greenland, so they're already, occupying part of it. There's only about 30,000 people that live in Greenland, so it is possible, in theory, to think that they could expand their presence in Greenland and build a bigger base or another base, or even build some type of missile defense system. I mean, we have funded the building of Israel's missile defense system, right? The Iron Dome. So these are other possibilities that are just completely off the table. They've gone from zero to, completely occupying the country. So it's incredibly concerning. And I think, again, like, we cover local news, we're here in Philly, but these struggles, for working class people are global, because ultimately we're the ones that pay the price. And when we talk about all the budget cuts and all the programs and services that are being eliminated and how that trickles down in Pennsylvania, and then we look at the military budget and how much is resourced to all of these interventions, that's the local connection, right? The fact that thousands of people are going to have to pay double or 3 times the amount for their Obamacare, the fact that so many people are going to lose access to SNAP benefits, the fact that we have a lack of affordable housing, and that a lot of the HUD programs have been cut. can be directly attributed to prioritizing our resources and our tax dollars to the Department of War budget.
Yeah. Well, Vanessa, thank you for that sobering report. Oh, go ahead, Denise.
We talk about military spending. I think it's important to note that as someone who grew up on military bases for that, the bulk of the spending does not go to the people who are fighting. The bulk of the spending goes to all the gadgets. It goes to the $400 toilets that don't work. It goes to the places where, you know, these soldiers try to take a shower and end up electrocuted. That is where the money goes. And as someone whose father had to go to Walter Reed to get his neck repaired because from, you know, military related injuries, only to find that when he retired, he could no longer go to the hospital he used to run for care. I think that when we look at military spending, we need to understand exactly where it's going. And that is the reason why cutting it is next to impossible. They have no problem cutting soldiers, because for a while there, they did cut soldiers, but they never cut the gadgets, because the gadgets are where the money is.
Yeah.
Right. They have reduced the military by more than 20%, and that is part of Pete's Hegseth's agenda. And to Denise's point, I mean, you could look at how much an F-14 or F-35 fighter jet costs, right? It's hundreds of millions of dollars. These aircraft carriers that carry the jets cost billions of dollars. And to your point, Larry, like this is going to defense contractors like Raytheon, like Boeing, like Lockheed Martin. And because 1/3 of our Navy is now deployed in the Caribbean, it's very likely that there are members of the Navy and the Air Force who are deployed from our area. So that means our local residents are the ones that are having to go out there and put their lives at risk. And it is true that when you look at, you know, the counterpart to defense, which are veterans benefits, that has also been gutted and defunded and divested from as well. So again, follow the money. Everything is connected, right? And as we see in the era of globalization, you know, things that are global are also local.
Right. Well, Vanessa, thank you so much. And we're going to be talking more about this in the weeks to come for sure, because who knows what's going to happen next. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Denise, it is now 2026.
Yes.
And
whether we like it or not.
Right. This is going to be a big year in Philadelphia. But what I want to talk a little bit about are some of the big government and political stories coming up this year. What are some of the key things that you think this show and our listeners and readers and watchers need to be focusing on as this year progresses?
Well, probably the biggest thing that I think our listenership and folks who read our newsletter should focus on is the home plan. Mayor Sherelle Parker's Housing Opportunities Made Easy plan. Because while council passed out the resolution, which will spend $277 million, much of it on people who are, you know, in lower to middle income brackets. And the bond issue is probably going to come up for a vote not too long after council comes back into session on January 22nd. This battle between council and the mayor about what, you know, who's going to get what from the first $200 million of the home plan, I don't think that's completely over yet. I think there's still some negotiation that the mayor's trying to do in the name of saving row homes and doing things like that. So I think that folks really need to keep an eye on that. And they also need to keep an eye on how the budget, which is coming up in March, plays into that. because if you budget, your budget tells your priorities. Who gets money from your budget tells us what you care about. That's why every year that council has had to add money for stuff like the mural arts program. Everybody loves the mural arts program. Jane Golden comes to council meetings and people treat her like a rock star. But the last two budget sessions, the mural arts program has been zeroed out from the mayor's budget, despite the good it does. Yeah. So look for the home program and how the budget plays into the home program. I think that's one of the most important things to look at. Another important thing to look at is the third congressional district race. Dwight Evans is stepping down. No one is saying why he's decided that he's not going to run again, but my guess is it's somehow connected to his health and how his health is he's had health issues over the last couple of years. He had a stroke and some other things have happened. So I'm guessing he's thinking, maybe I need to step aside and bring newer blood into this. And there's plenty of blood to choose from at the moment. These are people who have said they're running, but what everybody needs to remember is that no one is actually running for this office until after petitions are started in February and until those petitions are approved. Because while it's nice that you're hearing from folks like Ayla Stanford and Senator Sharif Street and State Reps Morgan Cephas and Christopher Rabb and all these people who say, I'm running for this office, not a petition has been filed yet. They haven't even been circulated yet. So keep an eye on that race, but understand that no one is actually running yet.
Right. And I agree with you, Denise. I don't really even look at these races until petitions are filed, until we know who's on the ballot for sure. And until then, it doesn't matter. And we're not going to know that until early March.
Exactly.
Petitioning will begin next month, goes for about 3 weeks. And then after that, then you'll have an idea. And just so people know, the way it works is to get on the ballot, you have to literally get a petition. You write down the office you're running for and your name, and you take it to your neighbors or really anybody in that district who can sign to say, okay, I support, Dwight Evans or whomever to be on the ballot for this race. And you have to get a certain number depending on which race you're running. And if they all check out, and I've been through this process many times. I used to run this in Delaware County for the Delaware County Democratic Party years ago. You take them to Harrisburg. They get checked, and they can be challenged. And I've seen some weird things on petitions because I would also do the other part where we would do challenges. Petitions have to be done the right way or they get thrown out and somebody can get kicked off the ballot. Famously, locally, we saw this in the 5th council district race a few years ago where 6 candidates got kicked off the ballot and only 1 remained. And guess who won that race? The one who remained. So petitions are really important and really matter. And like I said, I don't feel confident even talking about it or making predictions or anything like that until we get through that process.
Because there are lawyers in Philadelphia who all they do is challenge people's petitions. That's all they do. And they get paid very handsomely for it because there have been petition shenanigans. Like a couple of years ago, there was a scandal where a guy who called himself an election consultant was basically sitting at his kitchen table filling out petitions.
Yeah.
I mean, when they checked the handwriting and everything like that, they saw it was the same handwriting. The guy used the same address. And so he wasn't even smart about it.
No.
There have been petitions I've seen with Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck on them. And what's really sad is when you have people who are incumbents who mess up their petitions. And I'm like, wait a minute, you've already been in the office. You already know how this process goes. What are you doing? And most of the time when that happens, it's because they've outsourced it. That's something that if you're running for office, you should have total and complete control over. And speaking of offices, and I don't know how I could have forgotten this, all of the members of council are up for re-election. Or is that next year?
That's next year, Denise. You're a little bit ahead. Yeah, we got a little ways to go on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess I was doing some wishful thinking a little bit. But there is somebody who is up for election that everybody needs to keep an eye on, and that is Governor Josh Shapiro.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why there are a couple of reasons you need to keep an eye on that. One, because it'll be interesting to see if he even bothers to run for re-election, because B, the worst kept secret in town is that he's probably going to run for president in 2028. I saw an article in the Atlantic about him running for president, and it made a very interesting argument. Like he says, according to this article, that he is the guy to bring Republicans into the fold to vote for him for president. But it also points out that there are people in the Democratic Party that do not trust him. Right. And that's true, because particularly when you talk to people about Josh Shapiro in light of what happened with Kamala Harris when she ran for president and he was being considered for VP and she decided not to bring him on the ticket, one of the jokes was she would be the first president to need a food taster if he became her VP, because he is that ambitious. So it's even going to be interesting to see how Democrats here in the state, how hard they work for him to get reelected. I think the only reason why they put any kind of effort into it is because they don't want to lose that seat, because Sharif Street, who ironically enough is running for Congress, the reason why he's running for Congress and is no longer chair of the Democratic Party is because Shapiro, who had tried to get him voted out as chair when he became the Democratic nominee for governor, pushed everybody into saying that Sharif shouldn't be allowed to do both jobs, both run for Congress and be chair of the party. Now, I could see them getting rid of him as chair of the party based on the 2024 election results, which were, not a ringing endorsement for his remaining in that position.
Right.
But to connect it to his running for another office, that kind of told you that this was a continuation of something that had already been brewing. Mm-hmm. So again, that's another race that everybody should watch, it for no other reason but you haven't really done enough for the part of the state that votes the most, namely southeastern Pennsylvania. We still don't know what's happening with our public transit. And every time we've come to you for help with it, and you said you're going to help, you end up jettisoning us and jettisoning the need for public transit across the state in service of like maybe cyber charters or any number of things that you find more important. And yet you're going to be coming to us this year asking us to vote for you. Mm-hmm. And I really think that in Josh Shapiro's case, particularly here in Philadelphia, when people are still trying to figure out, is my train or bus going to be running, he's got some splaining to do.
Yep, I agree, Denise. I think it's more of a tall order than people might realize. So after all that, and it almost feels crazy to even talk about this because we're only in January. We're closer to last November than we are this upcoming November. Mm-hmm. We're going to have the congressional midterm elections, which will decide.
Don't remind me.
Yes, that will decide control of the United States House of Representatives. That's the big one in this election, and the United States Senate, which is a little more predictable, maybe, depending on how it looks. We're too far away to know anything about how that's going to go. We don't know who the candidates are going to be. There will probably be more retirements and resignations before then. once people start to see which way the wind's blowing, we are probably going to see some upsets in primaries. There's going to be all kinds of things that are going to happen before we even get to that. But that, after all the other things we've spoken about, will be probably the last thing on this election calendar for us for the year. And that's going to decide how Trump's last 2 years go. And I think, not counting what 2026 is, 250th anniversary, all that kind of stuff, this is a very consequential year. Not just in Philadelphia, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country. This is, and I feel like you say it a lot, and it's hyperbole when we start saying, well, this is the most important election ever. And this is, I'm not going that route, but I am saying that 2026, with all the things we've talked about here, because all the points you made were all the things I was thinking about. This is going to be a huge year for Philadelphia. And what happens in these elections, what happens in city council, is going to have a big impact on where we're going to be for a long time, I think.
Yeah.
I don't think these elections are just a 2-year or a 4-year thing. I think we're looking at a major turning point in how the city gets funding, how the city uses that money, where the money goes, and then what kind of leadership and what kind of representation we're getting out of Washington. And I think it's going to be crucial.
You're absolutely right. And it's ironic that this is happening on the 250th birthday of America, because the thought that I had when I saw what happened in Venezuela and the fact that Congress wasn't consulted, but oil company people and even the New York Times and Washington Post knew about this before members of Congress, and they held on to the story.
A tremendous dereliction of duty there, in my opinion.
I mean, even with all of that, I found myself thinking, what are we actually celebrating this year? America's 250th birthday. What are we actually celebrating? Benjamin Franklin said that we have a republic if we can keep it. And when you talk about how consequential these elections are going to be, these will be the elections that help us figure out whether or not our republic is keepable still. Because right now, anybody who has studied world history at all and doesn't see the parallels to 1930s Germany that are going on in the United States is either being willfully ignorant or just not paying attention.
And that is not hyperbole. That is an honest to God concern.
And it should be, because, I mean, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette just announced today that its way of solving its labor dispute with its reporters, a labor dispute that has been going on since 2017, by the way, is to shut the paper completely down in May. So basically, one of the 2 largest cities in Pennsylvania is all set to become a news desert based on this. And it's, the thing is, it makes what we do here, and it makes what independent news outlets do just that much more important, because there's even some talk among the folks at the Inquirer about no longer existing after a while. So we really need to keep an eye on whether or not America, as we have traditionally known it, is still going to exist, because there's a lot about the America we used to know that has changed irreparably. So when you say that this is a very consequential election for the long term, Larry, you are absolutely right.
And one of the issues that we follow here, and that is vitally important, is the effect, the decisions that government makes that affects the people who are suffering the most, the people who are living in poverty. And one of the key metrics of that, one of the key ways that we help people in poverty, is through the minimum wage and what the minimum wage is. And Lance Haber is here to tell us a little bit about changes across the country to various states minimum wage laws?
Happy New Year, Larry. Happy New Year, Denise. I'm actually going to have some good news, which is a nice change after listening to both of you. And it's incredibly sad for Pittsburgh to lose their newspaper. And I don't know how people are going to vote if they don't know what's going on. But there are literally millions of people who woke up after New Year's Eve to a pay increase. And I'm going to show you the states. If I can call up the slideshow, I'm going to show you the states because it's a very large number of states that raised the minimum wage for all of their people, pay increase for everybody on January 1st. And what's remarkable and what we'll see is it really has nothing to do with whether it's a so-called red state or a blue state, a Republican state where Trump won, or a state Democratic state where Vice President Harris took the electoral votes. So Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Maine, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, a very red state. Montana, a very red state. Nebraska, a very red state. New Jersey, New York, Ohio, a very large red state where the vice president's from. Rhode Island, South Dakota, which I don't think has elected a Democrat since the age of the Republic. Vermont, Virginia, and Washington. All of those states raised their minimum wage. But for those of us who live in Pennsylvania, we see on the list is not Pennsylvania. So to give some background, here's a picture of all the states that have raised the minimum wage. And this is more inclusive. This list I gave before was just the states that gave an increase on New Year's Day. This is everybody who has raised the minimum wage above the federal level. And I know it's shocking, but I just want to point out that the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. In all the states in white on this map, which you'll see is Pennsylvania as well, have decided to keep the minimum wage at the federal level. Now, as bad as that is, it's even worse when you consider what's called tip wages. And tip wages are much lower than minimum wage. Tip wage in Pennsylvania is $2.35 an hour. Now, I know those of us who are fortunate enough to go out to higher end restaurants where the bill could easily be $150 for two people with drinks, leave a tip and say, well, those waiters are doing pretty well. And that is true. The high-end restaurants, the waiters do well. But most of the wait staff in the state of Pennsylvania are people working in diners, people working in mom and pop restaurants, people working in places where you might have a meal for $15 or $20. And those waiters and waitresses, and tends to be women in the diners, are not doing nearly as well as if they were being paid a minimum wage. So if you take a second to look at the map, you can see one of the things that's really kind of amazing. Every state that touches Pennsylvania, including West Virginia, has raised its minimum wage. Every state. And even states that are led by people who do bizarro things, like Governor DeSantis in Florida, who does some really strange things, even he has seen the need to raise the minimum wage. Now, to put it in perspective, here are the surrounding states. New Jersey's is at $15.92. New York's a little confusing because New York has a separate minimum wage for New York City and the area around it and the rest of the state. And we don't touch New York City, but our northeastern and northwestern border of Pennsylvania touches the New York, what they call the southern tier. So you cross the border from Pennsylvania outside of Wilkes-Barre and Scranton, you go a little bit farther and you hit Binghamton and you hit where I know, Denise, isn't that where you worked?
I lived in Elmira, which is about 45 minutes from Binghamton.
Right. So that part of New York is at $16. Delaware, $15. Maryland, $15. Ohio's at $11. And as I said, even West Virginia has decided to raise the minimum wage. Now, I think most of us know that you cannot live a middle-class life on the minimum wage. It's simply impossible. And many states have decided that what they're going to do is try and help people reach a middle-class life. And one of the ways they do that is by raising the minimum wage. And just to make it clear how bad Pennsylvania is in terms of doing this, this is a map, and it may be a little hard to read, so the next one's going to be a little clearer, of this, how much it costs on average to buy a house. Now, averages are one of those things that are really very complicated to use to make a point, because what's the old saying? If Bill Gates and I were in the room, the average income would be billions of dollars. So averages really aren't that helpful. It's more helpful to have what's the normal. And that, unfortunately, is not very easy to come up with, because different parts of different states have different normals. So I'm just using these averages just to make the point. And this map kind of shows how much a house costs. And in Pennsylvania, the average home price is $300,000. Now, those of us who live in Philadelphia kind of look at that and go, there's no way that that's right. But again, I'm going to ask Denise, when you were working in Elmira, below you in Pennsylvania, what was the housing stock like?
Well, I had an apartment, and it was a nice place, but I had to put 2 of my paychecks together to pay what was a relatively low rent. My rent was only like $5.75 a month. And even though I was working for a newspaper, I was making so little money, I had to put 2 of my checks together to pay the rent.
Right. The housing costs in the northern part of Pennsylvania, once you get out of the commuting area to New York City, it's a lot of trailer parks, a lot of what we call double wides, a couple manufactured homes bolted together. So the average housing price isn't the average housing price in Philadelphia, which again is why it's very complicated. But the average housing price is $300,000, and the minimum wage is $725, meaning anyone who's making the minimum wage can't afford to buy the average house. In all the other states that have housing stock below the Pennsylvania housing stock price, they've raised the minimum wage to make it easier for people to become homeowners. So Ohio, the average house is $240,000. Now, Ohio is one of those states that continues to lose population. As the cities have crumbled, as the jobs have flown, despite what President Trump has said about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, that's not what's happening. And even with Vice President Vance being from Ohio, Ohio continues to lose population and lose jobs. $240,000 is the average price. The minimum wage there is $11. West Virginia, the average house price is $246,000. The minimum wage is $875. Michigan, $256,000. The minimum wage is $1373. Arkansas, again, a very Trumpian state, $256,000, minimum wage $11. Missouri, $250,000 for the average house price, $15 minimum wage. And finally, Nebraska, which no one's going to confuse with the state of Massachusetts politically. The average house price is $290,000. The minimum wage is $15. So this is what we're looking at in terms of Pennsylvania refusing to raise the minimum wage. And it becomes even harder to understand when we look at what the other side, the people who are opposed to raising the minimum wage, say. Now, the Cato Institute was created by the Koch brothers, and it's kind of a right-wing think tank. And what they say is, quote, some policymakers are proposing to raise the minimum wage, but that policy would be harmful. Research shows businesses would respond to the increased costs by reducing employment, particularly for low-skilled workers. Some businesses may pass the higher costs on to consumers. Despite the hope of the proponents, the minimum wage does little, if anything, to decrease poverty. And this is what the Republicans in Harrisburg continue to talk about when they refuse to raise the minimum wage. What they don't talk about is what has happened to the minimum wage in terms of buying power. Now, I know, again, most of us have heard President Trump blame former President Biden for all the price increases and for how hard it is to for people to make it meet. Pennsylvania has not raised the minimum wage in the last 17 years. Since 2009, the minimum wage in Pennsylvania has been $7.25 and even lower for tip workers. Today's prices are 1.5% higher than what they were in 2009. Again, and this is according to Trump's own economists. And I think most of us have seen that Trump's economists really post the information and statistics to help him look better. And so that becomes a real problem. Even according to him, a dollar today only buys 66 cents of what it bought in 2009. If you use Trump's own numbers, the minimum wage would have to be $10.50 an hour to keep up with the inflation, whoever's fault the inflation was. And again, I believe that number is too low. I believe it has to be at least 15. But I'm saying, just using the Trump numbers, his own people are saying if you wanted to keep the minimum wage at the level it was in 2009, when it was $7.25, you would have to raise it to $10.50 an hour. And Pennsylvania has decided not to do it. There's absolutely no correlation between economies, growing economies, state economies that have raised the minimum wage and growing and state economies that are failing. 3 of the economies that are supposed to be growing at the biggest rates, Florida, Delaware, and New York, have raised the minimum wage. There's nothing that has to do with job creations or good jobs. Wallet Hub, which again is a website, could be wrong, but this is what their study shows. They rank the best states for finding a job, and they list the top 4, which is Massachusetts, raised the minimum wage, Connecticut, Minnesota, and Vermont. All of them have raised the minimum wage. As the answer to the question, will it actually help people? Well, the Philadelphia Inquirer did a study, and they said that the 4 counties that surround Philadelphia, 400,000 people would see their income go up if they raised the minimum wage to $15 an hour. So I think we can see that, 1, the projections that would hurt state economies isn't true. 2, that Pennsylvania has not kept up. 3, they're not doing what they could to help people reach a middle-class life. And 4, that everybody knows this. This is not a secret. These numbers aren't something I had to work very hard to find. I just put them together. The Trump's people say the minimum wage that was set in 2009 now isn't enough, and because of inflation should be raised to at least $10.50. Now, I know Governor Shapiro is in favor of raising the minimum wage, like he's in favor of finding solutions for the public transit funding crisis. But it always is hard for me to understand how he could do such genius work on I-95 and can't solve these problems. Can't go out and campaign in Elk County and Potter County and all the Trump counties where people are living in poverty and need a pay increase, need a raise in minimum wage. Why he can't go out there and sell the idea that if we want to help people buy homes, if we want to help people rise to a middle-class life where they can have some dignity in retirement, why he can't persuade them to vote for candidates who will want to raise the minimum wage. And that's my report. I'm hoping that at some point, Governor Shapiro will talk again about raising the minimum wage and will actually go outside of where all the money people are, where all the nice parts of the state are, go out to these rural areas and actually talk to people. Whatever I think about Senator Fetterman, he did go out and talk to people in places that elected officials often don't. And as someone who has lobbied time and time again for increases in the minimum wage, and we go to the rural areas, we find that the candidates, the elected officials, are supportive but don't want to buck their leadership. And that's the issue.
All right. Well, Lance, thank you so much for that. And we will be back next week on another episode of Hall Monitor.